Hey everyone, we're back with the Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, and we're going to be talking about the Egyptian life, the ancient Egyptian lives, okay? And we've already talked some about the how religion was an important part of their lives, daily lives, and the temple and things, but we want to bring this more personal and talk about their homes, okay? And the homes of the early Egyptians were basically just had a wooden post and bundles of reeds. They kind of looked like huts, right? And they weren't great, but they were better than nothing. But as we moved on into a unified Egypt and the were able to create better housing, and they used mud brick houses, both for the rich and for the poor, okay? So it didn't matter what your stature was, you used mud bricks for your houses, and the mud kind of got everywhere. But that's okay. There were some differences, kind of, if we talk about, if you look at life in America now, there's differences in our housing, and usually that is based on your level of income, right? Whether you're rich or poor or, somewhere in between. And the ancient Egyptians weren't much different, okay? All their houses were made out of mud, but based on your economic status, the size was different, the facilities were different, the decorations were different, and they all, just depended on how wealthy you were. But again, they were made from mud, and mud was everywhere. The Nile River would overflow, and mud would be everywhere, and they used this mud to make their brick houses. But they didn't like the mud so much. They didn't want to live in the mud, but there wasn't a lot of land, so they moved to higher elevations and to make their houses. And the more wealthy you were, the higher you could go, and the more chance you could get out of the mud some. But because the limited high ground, limited spaces of the high ground, houses, as they went, generation to generation, and different people, they would build on top of these houses. So you would rebuild on the exact same sites, kind of over and over, knock the old one down, or it would start to fall down some, and you'd level it out, because then you're maybe even on higher ground, and then you build on top of it. And because of this, not many of the houses survived. However, there was a few different places that survived, and one of the most important ones it was a workers' village in Deir el Medina, near the Valley of the Kings. And this gave us some idea of what, the common man's housing situation was. This was a village of back in about 1550 BC. It was a bunch of craftsmen and artists, all who were building the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And instead of traveling back and forth, they just built this little village right on the outskirts of where they were building and lived there. And it gives us an idea of life, how life was in the New Kingdom. The village had one very long central street running north and south. It was very narrow and airless. Not a lot of air could circulate through the city. The houses were also long and narrow and on either side of the street, and only had 4 small rooms inside of them. They estimated there was roughly about 60 families that lived in this city, or in this little village. A few other places that survived that we got some information from was Karun near Fayum, and Tel El Armanina, which was Akhenaten's abandoned city. So the villages were more of the poorer people. Then you had and more rural people, and then you had towns, which were more in the cities, and then the rich people. So in the towns, there were a lot of similarities, and again, everything's built with the mud bricks. The buildings were also in the towns built very close together, but they were much taller. They were up to 4 floors in the cities, in these towns. The streets also were very narrow and very crowded, and they were filled with waste. Any type of garbage, sewage was all just kind of dumped out onto the street, and it was pretty filthy. For that reason, and trying to reach some cooler temperatures, most people spent a lot of times up on top of their roofs, and they would hang out up there and hopefully catch a little bit of a breeze and get away from kind of the nastiness of the street level. The rich people had, very different homes than everybody else, other than they were built with the same, mud bricks. But they had luxurious little villas, okay? Many different rooms in their homes. They had bedrooms, they had storage rooms, they had areas that you could do household work in. They had a kitchen, and then they usually all had a very big hall for entertainment purposes. The walls would get plastered and painted, and they usually had on the ground some type of lovely gardens with shade trees, and most of these also had a pool of some sort where they could, wade in and try to stay cool. All of the houses had some type of furniture, and again, depending on your level of income, it would depend on what you had. Some people had very little, others started to have a little bit more. The furniture would be made of local wood or reeds if you were on the lower end of the income bracket. But if you were richer, you could import expensive wood into the area and make your furniture out of this wood, cedar wood or ebony. And then, especially the rich, and even some of the lower class people or lower income people would have inlaid on their furniture, on their wood, gold and jewels and different things, just kind of decorate it some if they could. So inside this home, we would have the family life. And the family life would, kind of surrounded by the women. In Egyptian society, it truly revolved around the family and the women's role in that family. And they would run the household, the family household, and they would have the children. And especially in comparison to ancient civilizations, they had a lot more rights than other women did in different societies. But they still did not have complete equal status with the men. The education, most women could not read or write. Some of the upper class women were able to read and write. They got a little better education, and they could hold important jobs. Some of the jobs that the women would hold were courtiers and priestesses, entertainers, singers, dancers, and acrobats that would perform for, festivals or in front of the king. Some even had trade jobs as weavers or gardeners, professional mourners, and there were some, but very few, even doctors in that time. Nannies was a very big job at the time, especially most of the royal families or, the priests and even different people, higher, income people would have a nanny to help run their children. And the women were allowed to run their family businesses in the absence of the husband. The married life, the men, especially the kings, could have multiple wives. The common man usually just had one. They were usually around 20 years old when they got married. The women, on the other hand, usually had arranged marriages. They did not have a choice as to who they got to marry, and usually were married at around the age of 14, which is pretty early. Their married life, they again was different than a lot of ancient civilizations, even almost better than some of the more modern times, even here in America. The marriage had a legal settlement made up front of financial arrangements for both the husband and the wife. The husband gave the wife an allowance to live and to run the house, and both could own property. Even separately, the woman could own property separate from the man. And then they had to take care of their children, and they were basically a fund that would get set up for the children for their future endeavors. 2/3 of that had to come from the husband, and 1/3 of that came from the wife. And both parties, even back then, could file for divorce if that wasn't agreeable to them. So this is just a little bit of a highlight about the houses and family life of the early Egyptians. Hopefully you're reading the material, and we'll talk to you later.